Germany, early 1930s. A nation wounded by war, crushed by debt, and desperate for hope. Crowds gather in huge rallies, their voices rising as a new leader promises to restore pride and power. But behind the promises, there is a hidden enemy, not on the battlefield, but inside their own neighborhoods. For centuries, Jewish families had been part of German life. They were doctors who healed, teachers who inspired, scientists who won world honors, and shopkeepers who greeted their customers every morning. They shared the same streets, the same language, the same dreams. But in just a few short years, everything would change. Suddenly, Jewish children were pushed out of schools. Jewish businesses were marked, boycotted, and destroyed. Neighbors who once shared meals now turned away in silence. Step by step, Jews in Germany were pushed out of society, stripped of their rights, and marked for destruction. How did this happen so quickly? How could millions of ordinary people be convinced that their neighbors were dangerous, unworthy, even less than human? What lies and propaganda turned respect into hatred and friendship into betrayal? This is the untold truth about Jews in Hitler's Germany. A story not just of laws and orders, but of real lives, of families broken, of courage tested, and of a world that stood by as darkness spread. And it forces us to ask, if it happened there, could it happen again? Germany after the First World War was a nation struggling to breathe. The Treaty of Versailles had not just taken land and pride, it had stripped away hope. Inflation spiraled, money became worthless, and families lined up for bread that cost billions of marks. Yet even in this wounded land, there were sparks of brilliance in science, in music, in art, and in the slow rebuilding of a broken society. And in the middle of this fragile rebirth stood Germany's Jewish community. Numbering fewer than 1% of the population, roughly 500,000 people, Jews were deeply integrated into German society. They were not strangers. They were part of the fabric of everyday life. Walk down a Berlin street in 1928, and you might pass a Jewish-owned bookstore displaying the latest novels. Step into a cafe where Jewish intellectuals debated politics, or hear a Jewish violinist perform in a crowded concert hall. Jews were doctors healing patients, professors teaching at universities, journalists shaping public opinion, and businessmen helping rebuild the economy. They celebrated German holidays, spoke German, fought for Germany in World War I, and proudly called themselves German citizens. For them, there was no contradiction between being Jewish and being German. They belonged. But belonging is fragile when old prejudices never fully disappear. For centuries, Jews across Europe had been scapegoated for plagues, blamed for economic crises, and accused of disloyalty. Even in modern Germany, anti-Semitism simmered quietly beneath the surface. While many Germans accepted their Jewish neighbors, others resented their success or clung to old myths that Jews were different or untrustworthy. During the prosperous moments of the Weimar Republic, these whispers were easy to ignore. But as soon as crisis returned, those whispers grew louder. By the late 1920s, the world economy collapsed in the Great Depression. Millions of Germans lost their jobs. Banks failed. Families starved. Fear and anger filled the streets, and people desperate for answers turned not to reason but to blame. It was in this storm that Adolf Hitler's voice found power. His speeches were not sophisticated arguments. They were raw, emotional attacks. He told Germans that their suffering was no accident. It had been caused by traitors, by conspirators, by the Jews. He painted them not as individuals, not as neighbors, not as fellow Germans, but as a dangerous other who had betrayed the nation. At first, many dismissed his words. After all, they knew Jews personally, as classmates, as doctors, as friends. But propaganda does not need truth to succeed. It needs fear, repetition, and an audience desperate for hope. And in the hungry, broken Germany of the 1930s, Hitler's poison began to spread. Before the storm of Nazism fully took hold, Jewish life in Germany was still vibrant. Families gathered on Friday evenings to light Sabbath candles, sharing meals filled with laughter. Children studied Hebrew in religious schools, but also excelled in German universities. Jewish artists filled theaters with plays, musicians filled concert halls, and scientists like Albert Einstein pushed the boundaries of knowledge. It was a world full of promise. Many Jews believed their future in Germany was secure, that the hatred of the past was finally fading. They built homes, raised children, and dreamed of better days ahead. But beneath this normalcy, danger crept closer. Newspapers spread anti-Semitic cartoons, portraying Jews as greedy and corrupt. Right-wing political groups shouted in the streets, calling for boycotts of Jewish businesses. And slowly, what had once been whispers of suspicion turned into shouts of anger. For many Jews, the first signs of change were subtle but painful. A non-Jewish friend who once visited often stopped coming by. A shopkeeper who had always been polite now served with a cold silence. Children in school began hearing slurs, words they had never known before. It wasn't yet official policy, but it was the beginning of exclusion. A kind of invisible wall was rising between Jews and their neighbors. And though many still hoped it was temporary, the truth was clear. Belonging was slipping away. Meanwhile, Hitler and the Nazis were gaining strength. His rallies were spectacles, thousands of people waving flags, chanting slogans, their faces lit by torches and by fury. For those watching, it was intoxicating, and for Jews, it was terrifying. What made this betrayal especially cruel was the deep loyalty many Jews felt toward Germany. In World War I, more than 100,000 German Jews had served in the army. Over 12,000 had died for their country. Many believed this sacrifice had proven their patriotism. They had shed blood for Germany. Surely, they thought, their place in the nation was secure. But Hitler's propaganda twisted even this sacrifice. He claimed Jews had not fought bravely, that they had betrayed the army from within. Lies replaced truth. History was rewritten. And slowly, public memory itself became poisoned. By the time Hitler rose to power in 1933, Jewish life in Germany was already under pressure. Within months, Jewish civil servants lost their jobs, Jewish lawyers were pushed out of courts, and Jewish doctors were banned from treating non-Jewish patients. Universities that had once welcomed Jewish professors now dismissed them. Students who had grown up together found themselves in segregated classrooms. The vibrant world of Jewish life, the theaters, the shops, the schools began to vanish, not all at once but piece by piece. Families that had felt secure for generations suddenly questioned their future. Could they stay? Should they leave? Where would they even go? Many held on, hoping the madness would pass. They told themselves Germany had been their home for centuries. Surely it would remain so. But the storm was only beginning. It is not about death camps or mass deportations. It is about the slow, deliberate breaking of trust, the erosion of belonging, and the betrayal of neighbors. It is about the vanishing world of Jewish life in Germany, a world that had been rich with promise, only to be slowly strangled by hatred. Before we can understand the horrors that followed, we must understand this first stage, when ordinary families still lit Sabbath candles, still opened their shops, still walked the same streets as their neighbors, not knowing how quickly those streets would turn against them. This was the calm before the storm, the last breath of normalcy before history's darkest chapter began. January 30th, 1933, the day Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. For many Germans, it was a day of excitement, a chance for national rebirth. For Jews, it was the beginning of the end. At first, life seemed to continue as usual. Shops still opened, Children still went to school and trains still ran through the cities. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The Nazi Party, once a fringe movement, now held the full machinery of the state, and they wasted no time turning their words into action. Within weeks, Jewish civil servants, professors, and lawyers were dismissed from their jobs. Signs appeared in parks and swimming pools. Jews not welcome. Businesses owned by Jews were boycotted. Newspapers printed endless streams of anti-Semitic articles, portraying Jews as thieves, traitors, and enemies of the German people. For Jews, it was disorienting. One day they were respected professionals, neighbors, citizens. The next, they were treated as outcasts. It didn't happen overnight with violence. It happened step by step, through laws, restrictions, and humiliation, until normal life became impossible. The Nazis understood that to destroy a community, you must first isolate it, and so came the flood of laws. In 1935, the infamous Nuremberg Laws were passed. These laws stripped Jews of German citizenship. They could no longer vote, hold public office, or marry non-Jews. Even friendships between Jews and non-Jews were discouraged, then punished. Suddenly, neighbors who had once shared meals together became strangers separated by law. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Universities banned Jewish students. Doctors and lawyers were forbidden from serving non-Jews. Businesses owned by Jews were Aryanized, stolen, and handed over to non-Jewish Germans. Imagine being a child in this world. One day, you sit in class with your best friend. The next, you are told you don't belong, that you are different, that you are no longer welcome. Imagine being a doctor, respected for years, suddenly told you cannot heal patients because of who you are. Imagine owning a shop built by your grandparents, only to see a Nazi official walk in and claim it as his own. This was not just discrimination, it was erasure. Step by step, Jews were being erased from German life. The turning point came on the night of November 9, 1938. Known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, it was a nationwide pogrom unleashed against Jews. In cities across Germany, Nazi stormtroopers and civilians attacked Jewish businesses, synagogues, and homes. Windows were smashed, Torah scrolls burned, cemeteries desecrated. Firefighters stood by as synagogues went up in flames. Their orders were clear: let Jewish buildings burn. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Hundreds were killed. Thousands of businesses were destroyed. Streets were littered with shattered glass, reflecting the flames of burning synagogues against the night sky. For many Jews, Kristallnacht was the moment of realization. This was not just about exclusion anymore. This was about destruction. A clear message had been sent: Jews had no place in Germany. Yet even then, many families stayed. Some could not leave, other countries closed their doors, refusing to take in large numbers of Jewish refugees. Others held on to hope that the violence was temporary, that it would pass. After all, Germany had been their home for centuries. Leaving was unthinkable. As the years passed, Jews were pushed further to the margins. In many cities, they were forced to move into designated Jewish houses or ghettos. These were cramped, overcrowded apartments where several families were packed together. Privacy disappeared. Dignity disappeared. Food was rationed, and Jews often received less than others. Curfews were imposed. They were banned from owning radios, bicycles, or even pets. Step by step, their lives were stripped of color, reduced to survival. Children who once dreamed of becoming doctors, musicians, or athletes now dreamed only of food, warmth, and safety. Parents who had once built businesses or careers now spent their days standing in lines, begging for ration cards, or searching for scraps of dignity in a society that had turned against them. Everyday life became an act of endurance, and the worst was yet to come. The Nazis understood that fear was a weapon. Gestapo agents, the secret police, monitored every neighborhood. Informants were everywhere. A careless word, a complaint, or even a sympathetic gesture toward a Jewish neighbor could result in arrest. This atmosphere of fear didn't just isolate Jews. It also silenced those who might have helped them. Many Germans who disagreed with the persecution stayed quiet, afraid of being punished themselves. Silence became complicity. For Jews, the fear was constant. A knock on the door at midnight could mean deportation. A raid could mean being dragged to a camp. Even children lived with the terror that tomorrow their family might disappear. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, the situation had become unbearable. Jews tried desperately to leave Germany. Some managed to escape to America, Britain, or Palestine, but many found the doors of the world closed. The Evian Conference of 1938, a meeting of nations to discuss Jewish refugees, ended with excuses. Countries claimed they could not take in more people during a global depression. For Jews, the message was devastating. There was nowhere to run. Those who remained in Germany lived under constant threat. Their world had shrunk to ghettos, curfews, and fear. And then came the deportations. Families were rounded up, forced onto trains, and sent to camps. At first, many didn't know what awaited them. They believed the lies that they were being resettled for labor, but the truth was far darker. This is the story of how persecution became a way of life. It is about laws that erased rights, violence that destroyed communities, and fear that silenced the nation. It is about neighbors turning away, friends disappearing, and families living in a world that no longer saw them as human. This was not yet the full horror of the Holocaust, but it was the road that led there. A road paved with silence, with broken glass, with stolen shops, with burned synagogues, and with the slow suffocation of an entire community's identity. By the time the world realized what was happening, it was already too late for millions. The machinery of destruction was in motion. By the early 1940s, life for Jews in Germany was no longer just about humiliation or exclusion. It was about survival against a machine built for their destruction. The ghettos, the laws, the boycotts, they were only the beginning. Now came the deportations. Families were ordered to report to train stations with only what they could carry. They were told they were being resettled for work. Mothers packed bags with clothing, food, and family photographs, believing they would soon need them. Children clutched dolls or school books. Fathers carried tools, convinced they would be put to labor. But when the trains arrived, reality was far different. Jews were packed into cattle cars, dark, airless, without water or toilets. Journeys lasted days. Many died before even reaching their destination. Those who survived the ride would never forget the stench, the screams, the suffocating air. And at the end of those tracks lay places whose names would forever be associated with horror. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. Camps that were not resettlement centers but factories of death. The first thing taken from Jews at the camps was not their luggage. It was their identity. Upon arrival, men, women, and children were separated. Families were torn apart in an instant. Husbands and wives said hurried goodbyes, often not knowing it was their last. Mothers tried to hold onto their children, only to be forced away by guards. Prisoners were stripped of their belongings, their clothes, even their names. They were given numbers tattooed onto their skin. Hair was shaved. Uniforms handed out. From that moment, they were no longer seen as people, but as numbers in a system designed to erase humanity. Some, the elderly, the sick, mothers with small children, were sent immediately to gas chambers. They were told they were going to take showers. Instead, they were locked inside rooms where poison gas was released. Within minutes, their lives were extinguished. Those selected to live faced forced labor. They worked long hours in brutal conditions, digging ditches, building roads, or working in camp factories. Food rations were barely enough to survive, a crust of bread, thin soup, sometimes nothing at all. Disease spread quickly. Guards beat prisoners for the smallest mistakes. Death was everywhere, in the chimneys, in the barracks, in the silent absence of those who never returned from roll call. The Holocaust was not chaos. It was carefully organized. The Nazis built an entire system designed to murder millions efficiently. Trains brought Jews from across Europe. Camps were divided into zones: arrival, selection, labor, extermination. Gas chambers were disguised as shower rooms to prevent panic. Crematoria burned bodies day and night. Records were kept of numbers killed, as if human lives were just statistics. This was industrial-scale murder, carried out with cold calculation. Guards treated prisoners not as humans but as cargo. Bureaucrats filled out forms, scheduling transports, ordering supplies of poison gas. Doctors conducted experiments on prisoners, using them as subjects for cruel medical research. It was a system in which every part of the Nazi state, from the army to the railways to ordinary businesses, played a role. The death of millions was not the work of a few men. It was the work of a nation that had allowed hatred to become policy. And yet, even in this world of despair, there was resistance. In ghettos and camps, Jews fought back in whatever ways they could. Some smuggled food to keep others alive. Some secretly taught children, preserving culture and hope. In Warsaw in 1943, Jews launched an armed uprising against the Nazis. Though it was crushed, it showed the world that even in the face of certain death, they refused to surrender their dignity. In camps like Sobibor and Treblinka, prisoners staged revolts, killing guards and breaking out in desperate attempts to escape. Many were killed, but some survived, carrying with them the story of what had happened inside. Resistance was not only about weapons, it was about survival itself. Every act of keeping faith, every prayer whispered in secret, every effort to keep a child alive was an act of defiance against a system designed to erase them. By 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, they began to discover the camps. Soldiers who had expected to find enemy troops instead found skeleton-like prisoners, piles of bodies, and evidence of crimes so vast that words failed. At Bergen-Belsen, at Buchenwald, at Auschwitz, soldiers wept at what they saw. The world could no longer deny what had happened. The truth was there in the ashes, in the survivors, in the silence of places where millions had died. But liberation did not mean freedom. For many survivors, their families were gone, their homes destroyed, their health broken. They were liberated, but they were also alone. Displaced persons camps were set up to house them. Slowly, some rebuilt their lives, emigrating to America, to Palestine, to new homes across the world. The trauma, however, never left. Survivors carried scars, physical and emotional, that lasted their entire lives. The Holocaust was not just a tragedy for Jews. It was a tragedy for humanity. It showed how quickly civilization can collapse when hatred is given power. It showed how ordinary people, neighbors, co-workers, even friends, can become silent while injustice grows. The legacy of Jews in Hitler's Germany is not only about suffering, it is about resilience. Survivors became witnesses, telling their stories so the world would not forget. They built new families, new communities, and dedicated their lives to ensuring the next generation would learn. The Holocaust is remembered not only in museums and memorials, but in every story told, in every life rebuilt, in every act of courage that survived the darkness. This is not just about death, it is about truth. The truth of what happens when hatred goes unchecked. The truth of what was lost when neighbors turned away. And the truth that, even in the darkest moments, humanity can endure. The untold story of Jews in Hitler's Germany is not just history. It is a warning. It is a lesson that silence can be deadly, that prejudice can grow into persecution, and that every voice matters in defending justice. When we look back at this story, we must not only mourn the past, we must ask ourselves the hardest question. If it happened once, could it happen again?